For somebody that hasn't adopted the diet we've been talking about today, they're spiking blood glucose. Let's talk about the reaction on a micro level in the body when that happens. And then insulin is going to follow that, and it causes problems independently.
Correct. So if you spike your blood sugar and you overwhelm your glycogen sponge, then yes, you will spike insulin. And insulin then brings the blood sugar down. And what's interesting about insulin is it's what insulin responds to is not the total amount of carbohydrate that you consumed, but the rate of change. So if your blood sugar goes up very quickly, then you will get a large spike of insulin. Whereas conversely, if your blood sugar rises very slowly, then you will get a much lesser spike of insulin. And so when you spike insulin, that brings the blood sugar down. And as the blood sugar starts to fall, if it falls rapidly, then the brain will move into panic mode. And the panic hormone is adrenaline, and what adrenaline will do is stimulate more sugar release from glycogen in the liver. So you end up, but if you're spiking adrenaline, that's what drives high blood pressure. And the other problem with a glucose spike is that makes for sticky blood, and those are the two major mechanisms by which arteries are damaged. Sticky sugar in the bloodstream is sticky. It sticks to the lining of blood vessels. It sticks to red cells and makes them sticky, and that damages the arteries, which then have to be healed and repaired. And cholesterol is involved in the healing and repairing process. Cholesterol does not damage our arteries. Cholesterol is part of the healing and repairing. It's an innocent bystander. And then, of course, pressure. So if you increase the pressure, if you double the pressure, let's say a hypothetical situation, if you double the blood pressure, you increase the turbulence 16-fold. And it's turbulence that damages the delicate lining of blood vessels. So that's why blood pressure is so bad for us, because again, they have to be healed and repaired, and the healing and repairing involves scar tissue, and that scar tissue is called atherosclerosis, and that narrows the blood vessels and impairs the blood supply, and that takes years to evolve. So, and again, if you're spiking insulin and then you're spiking adrenaline, then your blood sugar then falls, and then you're craving sugar and carbohydrates again. So it's very easy to spot the carbohydrate addict, as you know, because they're constantly hungry, they're constantly snacking, they're never satisfied, they've got poor levels of energy, overweight, fermenting gut, etc.
Okay, so you've talked about these glycogen sponges, which are like buffers in the body, which are used before insulin comes in. Let's make sure we're really clear on how those work, and then practically how we make sure we're depleting them on a regular basis.
Okay, one other little tip, which I forgot to mention, is one of the problems of fructose, fruit sugar, and also is the sugar that's derived from corn syrup, is that inhibits the enzyme that allows us to mobilize glycogen. So fruit is more likely to make us a sugar addict than anything else, because if the blood sugar drops, then the body can't correct, and so we get hungry and low blood sugar even faster for consuming fruit. Well, I've forgotten what your question was. So what's the question again?
Well, let's stick on this, and then we can move into that. Talking about the difference between fruit, which contains fructose, and
Yep.
before you describe fruit as little bags of sugar,
Yep.
versus somebody using white sugar, because we have our 5 a day fruit as the part of the base of the pyramid, something we want to be including on a regular basis. It's given not just a free pass, but promoted as something we want to include on a regular basis, and quite a bit of it. So how do you look at the difference there between sugar and then a high sugar fruit?
Well, neither are desirable. And that food pyramid is completely upside down. We should be base loading with fat and meat and eggs and fish, and then maybe some green vegetables and just occasional fruit, the occasional sugar as a treat, because both so dysregulate our metabolism for a multiplicity of reasons that we should only be consuming them on an occasional basis. We can cope with them in the short term for short bursts of time, but we should not be consuming it on a regular basis. And the government's advice of the 5 a day of fruit and vegetables is risible. It's laughable. It has no basis in physiology or biochemistry. And I think even Robert Kennedy is saying just this, that the food pyramid is upside down. So yes, those foods, if we're starving and there's nothing else to eat, okay, but it's not the best nutrition.
And another thing we can tie into that as well are these quote unquote healthy sweeteners like honey, maple syrup. Those, again, even in the paleo world, are often given a free pass, and they don't fit within the paradigm we've been talking about, where we want to bring the carbs down, get into ketosis, bring those in.
Correct. Those, okay, for the occasional binge, fine, but not on a regular basis. And in fact, honey is full of fructose, so that's as bad as eating fruit. And artificial sweeteners, the body's intelligent, and if you taste something sweet in the mouth, the body will release hormones in anticipation of a sugar spike. I mean, looking at some of the basic figures, it astonishes me how little sugar we have in the bloodstream. So the bloodstream is comprised of about 5 liters of blood. And to have a normal blood sugar, you just need 1 teaspoon, 5 grams of sugar. So 1 gram in a litre, it's a tiny amount. So, if you've not got an effective way of mopping up that sugar from the gut, you don't need much sugar or honey to spike your blood sugar very quickly. So, and I say artificial sweeteners are similarly toxic because they generate the same hormonal response as sugar. So they really should just be avoided. They're not evolutionarily correct foods. And we can cope perfectly well with low blood sugars. I'll just give you an example of this. There were 2 intrepid explorers who decided, Ranulph Fiennes and Mike Stroud, who decided to walk across Antarctica via the South Pole unaided. And what that meant is they had to carry with them or tow with them all the supplies they needed. Now, of course, the most energy dense food is fat. So they went with lots of butter and coconut oil and fatty foods in order to power them as they went. But Mike Stroud, so they were in permanent ketosis throughout. They lost 25, they didn't quite make it. They both lost 25 kilos in weight. It was obviously a massively stressful event. But Mike Stroud was a doctor, a GP, and he was doing bloods regularly to see what was happening. And their blood sugars, now a normal blood sugar should run between about 4 and 6 millimoles per litre, were often below 1 millimole per litre. But they had no symptoms of hypoglycemia. Why? Because they're in ketosis. They were functioning very well on ketones, and that powered them through that exercise. So we can run very low blood sugars and function perfectly well, and that's what we should really be aiming for.
You brought up artificial sweeteners. I'm assuming in that context you're referring to things like aspartame. But how do you feel about ones that are in the natural world, things like stevia, monk fruit?
It's that the same principles apply. The body is intelligent, and if it tastes something sweet in the mouth, it will anticipate a sugar rush and start producing insulin, in response to that. So, and the other point is that it keeps the addictive craving for sugars going. So for the occasional treat, that's fine. But if you're using them all the time, then it switches on that sugar craving, and that's not good either, because we then can't get sugar out of our minds. And I know this from myself. I know I'm an addict, and if I have 1 bit of sugar, then I think wouldn't mind a bit more. Oh, wouldn't mind a bit more. But if I have none, I forget about it. And I'm sure the rest of the world is as addictive a tendency as I do.
I think it's just normal, yeah. Let's come
hard
back to the
work.
glycogen sponges. That's
Yes.
where I was trying to take it before. So what I want to get into there, we have our 2 glycogen sponges, the liver and the muscles. What does it look like using those in a healthy way, depleting them, and then allowing them to be there as a buffer.
I think that's totally acceptable. And that's what we should be doing most of the time. I mean, the glycogen sponge can hold about 1,700 calories of sugars. So, you know, you've got to have, if your glycogen sponge is truly squeezed dry, then it can mop up a lot of sugar before it starts spilling over into the bloodstream. And we know this from the marathon runners. Marathon runners, many of them run on carbohydrates, and they carb load before a competition. But if they don't top up with sugar, so they're running along and they're constantly being fed tubes and jelly babies and goodness knows what, then they hit a wall at about 17 miles when they've exhausted their glycogen sponges. They don't have the metabolic flexibility to move into ketosis, and they just run out of energy. They just stop. But by contrast, the keto-adapted athletes, we all carry, even those ultra slim, super fit athletes, they still have quite a load of fat in the body, and that works the perfect fuel. So Mike Morton, who's a keto-adapted athlete, he holds the world record for the furthest distance run in 24 hours. He didn't need to eat, but he ran 172 miles in 24 hours. Yes, he had to have some water and some electrolytes, but he didn't need to eat. Why? Because he's running perfectly well on ketones. And again, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Let's go back to, you know, primitive man. You know, if he was hunting down his prey and he was a persistent hunter, it was no good if he ran out of fuel after, you know, a few miles, because the animal would just run off and that'd be the end of his hunt. But running on ketones, he could run and run and run and run and therefore be a successful hunter. So ketones are so important. But if the glycogen sponge is well squeezed dry because you're well into ketosis and, you know, you're not eating all the time, so you're not topping up constantly, then you can cope with quite a bit of carbohydrate without spiking your blood sugar. So I love potatoes. And the way I do potatoes is I cook them in the day and let them go cold. And that turns much of the starch to resistant starch. And then I fry them in lots of fat. And, you know, what I know is I just need 2 or 3 of those and I feel very satisfied. So I know I'm not addicted to it. I know I'm not getting a carbohydrate hit from that. And it's partly because of the resistant starch, partly because they're fried in fat, and partly because I'm eating it with, you know, meat and maybe some green vegetables. And, you know, when I wear a monitor, it doesn't spike my glucose. So we're all a little bit different. And that's why the monitor is so helpful, because it tells you exactly what you can and can't get away with. So what I like people to do is to get on the regime as best as they can, and then test to make sure that it's sufficient, that if they know what they can get away with without spiking sugar, and if they do, make sure that it comes down quickly, and therefore you can do this yourself. You can manage it yourself, you know, perfectly, efficiently and well.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
For insulin to work, it's got to have some essential cofactors. Things like chromium, carnitine, vitamin B3 and vitamin B1. We can have insulin resistance because the insulin receptor is blocked.